different generations, some senior, some junior, some very junior, and people who have done field work for decades and people who have just done their field work much more recently. So a couple of things. One, this webinar follows a webinar we organized last semester on the job market in China, and both of these webinars are directed at PhD students studying Chinese politics. We have a website, and I have just sent an email to everybody from whom you got the information, so your mentors, advisors, professors, that has that website address. Maybe Dan can put it up on the chat at some point, but it will have the previous webinar, it will have this webinar, and it will also have other opportunities. I wanted to say that the New Faces Conference, the third New Faces Conference at Duke will happen this August, and that's a conference where it's by competition, advanced graduate students, usually students on the job market, come to present their work and have it discussed in a workshop format. In 2022, another New Faces Conference will be held in Wisconsin-Madison with Reed building on his experience at NYU organizing conferences. And then in future years, we're going to have New Faces conferences at Yale, at Harvard, and at Penn. Okay. So let me talk a little bit, just very briefly, about how this, you know why this is organized. We thought of having a pro and con field work, but when we discussed it, the five of us are pro field work. So we thought, let's take a stance. We don't need to hear from people who are, well, maybe, we shouldn't be doing field work, or we understand there are all kinds of methods of doing research, but we think field work is valuable. And we also think field work is more challenging now in China. So we wanted to organize this conference about doing field work and not, and making the case for field work, and then talking about how to do field work. So we're organized in 3 sections. We're going to begin with some scholars giving their reflections and advice to junior scholars on field work. And then we're going to have 2 panels. And the 2 panels will be, the speakers will be beginning with statements, but they'll also be much more interactive. They'll be interviewed by moderators, by one of us 5 or 2 of us 5. And at the same time, we want you to put your questions at the same time as that interview is going on. Put your questions in the chat, because while one of us will be focusing on interviewing and asking questions, the other will be focused mostly on the chat, on the questions that appear in the chat, and selecting from that and interjecting and saying, oh, we have an interesting question that I want to raise. So it's interactive. It's not going to be set piece, then Q&A. So I just wanted to say that. Make sure you are writing your questions in panels 2 and 3, why field work and how to do field work as that is happening. Okay, so without further ado, we have invited some top scholars for whom fieldwork is integral to their research, and we've asked them something really tough. We've asked them to be brief, and I've already vetoed Andy Murtha's PowerPoints. He's lived in DC too long. What can I say? It's not been long, but he wanted to do the PowerPoint. We've asked them to address this prompt. please share the single most important piece of advice you have for junior scholars doing field work in China. And so I'm going to introduce these scholars in the order that they will be presenting, and I'll introduce them all at once, and then I'll just invite them to present. We're going to begin with Dorothy Solinger. She is a professor emerita of political science, University of California, Irvine, followed by Andrew Murtha, who is the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University, followed by Susan Whiting, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at University of Washington, Seattle, and then finally Lily Tsai, who is the Ford Professor of Political Science at MIT. So, Dory, why don't you start us off?
Well, first of all, I just thought I would make note of two things that are sort of personal. Number one, I first began to interview in 1983, so I did that for a long time. And secondly, I wrote an article called Interviewing Chinese People that was published in 2006, and it's still cited. So I didn't even look at it because right away when I understood the prompt, I thought what I would say is the most important thing is to be well informed when you go to the interview in two ways. Number one, be well informed about your subject and ideally facts about it that might not be well known so that you become trustworthy to your interlocutor, that you're not just stabbing in the dark, but you really know what you've come to find out about. And you're not somebody just casually trying to pick their brains, but you will get more information if you show that you, and also they won't worry if they're telling you something secret because you already know that. So that's the first thing about being informed. And the other thing is try to be informed about the standpoint, the emotional standpoint of your informant so that you can try to sound like you're on their side. And I sometimes couldn't get people to answer a question until I acted like I sympathized with them. Oh, your work must be so hard because of X. And I would say what X is. And that would suddenly open them up. And this was all 30 years ago. I don't know if they'd ever open up today, but back then they opened up when I showed that I sympathized with their standpoint. So that's it.
That's great, Dory. Thanks. I think they would still open up to you today, Dory.
Well, just a PS, I've interviewed everybody from officials in Beijing to unemployed people and street sellers and everything in between. So yeah, it seems to work.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew Murtha.
Thanks very much, Melanie, and thank you everybody for organizing this. This is really wonderful. So my PowerPoint that I can't show you has 10 points. It's my kind of my own shirt gal, but we'll make that available to everybody afterwards. So if there's a single thing that's probably the most important or was the most important for me when I was a doctoral student going to the field for the first time, it's this. And there's actually three parts to it. So the first part is that expect to have a debilitating or close to debilitating degree of imposter syndrome when you first start out. You're going to feel like you're in over your head. It's going to feel like you've fooled everybody up until now. Now that now the check is coming due. And in fact, what it is just an environment that takes just a lot of kind of getting used to, but primarily it's going to take you. You're going to have to do a lot of grunt work to get to the point where you are actually starting to get the interviews that you need. Generally speaking, a rule of thumb is that if you're there for a year, maybe the first 3 months, 4 months, you're going to feel like you're not getting anything and maybe it's time to pack up and go home. Around the fourth month, all of a sudden you start getting a couple bites and things start moving forward. And then by the end, you're telling people that, who you would have cut off your left arm to talk to just half a year ago, that you don't have time for them because you have too many other people set up with that. Trust me, that is how it plays out. Now, of course, then the question will be, well, why would anybody speak to me in China? And there's a lot of answers to that, so I'm not going to get into that. But the thing to keep in mind is that nobody there owes you anything. So if you don't get the interview, you don't get the interview. If you don't get the information, you don't get the information. Don't be angry. Don't be resentful. Please don't be rude. But know that it is something that all of your successes are based, or all of your success is based on the goodwill of the people who are your interlocutors. And then finally, what I would say is, and this really builds on what Dory was saying, I couldn't agree with her more, but a different variant of this is to be interactive with and interesting to your sources. That can mean very different things. I was very interesting to people in Guiyang in 1998 because there weren't many foreigners there. My barbarian handler in an unnamed province was very interested in the questions that I was asking and wanted to know the answers, so he got me interviews with people that I should have had no business getting interviews with, because he wanted to know the answer. So there's a lot of other tricks of the trade that I'm happy to share. I'll send out a PDF of that PowerPoint, but I'm looking forward, as you all are, to what others have to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. Turning now to Susan Wang.
Yeah, thanks for the organizers. This is a fabulous initiative, and I'm glad so many people are taking advantage of it. I want to draw on my experience conducting semi-structured interviews at the grassroots as part of multi-method research design, and especially where it's important to spend time in one place and to triangulate among a range of stakeholders to really understand the lay of the land, as it were. And my advice is on finding an appropriate affiliation, or a guakao danwei. And I think it's increasingly difficult to do field work without an appropriate sponsor today. And that was perhaps less true in the past, but very important today. So among the affiliations that I've worked under have been a government ministry, academies at the central and provincial levels, universities. All of these are differently positioned in the administrative hierarchy. They're differently connected with local communities. Some have feet on the ground, some do not, with distinct benefits and constraints. And these benefits and constraints change over time, and they change with the broader political, ideological environment. Universities are typically the most appropriate affiliation, and don't ignore second and third tier institutions in planning your fieldwork. They're often extremely well connected in local communities, and they can help you arrange adequate time to do thorough research in a particular setting. If you don't already have connections or connections through your advisors, read the Chinese language journal literature on your topic. If you have connections, read it anyway. This is one valuable way to identify scholars and institutions with whom you can seek affiliation. You may not find the right institutional affiliation on the first try, and you may seek new affiliations in the process of your fieldwork. Try again. But I think especially in the contemporary environment, it's really important to find appropriate affiliations to position yourself to take full advantage of qualitative research, whether that's to develop or refine a survey questionnaire, to identify untheorized variables in a pure qualitative study, to uncover new relationships. So I really want to make this piece of advice to help you get situated to realize these benefits. And then just one final thought, and there might be some debate on this. When you get there, whether it's to the household or the enterprise or the village committee, I recommend setting aside your devices, your recording devices, your laptops. taking notes at most can really go a long way to put your interlocutors at ease. And there may be much debate on that topic.
Thanks, Susan. I too am a big fan of offering people complete deniability. You know, that foreigner didn't understand a word I was saying. You know, her Chinese isn't too good. Okay, Lily's hi from MIT.
Melanie, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm a big believer in public goods provision, and you know, the fact that all of you are investing and providing these public goods is an enormous service.
Can you speak louder, please?
Oh yeah, can you hear me okay?
That's better.
So as I thought about what to share, I thought that one of the most important things that I always have to remember is that I don't know what I don't know, and fieldwork can help with that. I was thinking back to my PhD, and 1997, I've written the first draft of a dissertation prospectus that hypothesizes villagers' representative assemblies. You remember those? Nobody talks about those anymore. But my hypothesis was that VRAs made it more likely for villages to have better public goods provision. And I spend the summer in China in 1997. I interview something like 50 villagers in 6 different provinces. And I, number one, start to realize that VRAs are endogenous to more important factors. And number two, what really seems to make a difference in public goods provision is the existence of temple and lineage institutions, which I didn't even know existed before I started the field work. So, you know, I just don't know what I don't know. And fieldwork is really critical for helping me understand that. This happens over and over again with every project that I do. Relatedly, sometimes fieldwork is important because you also don't know what you actually know. I was doing research in Mexico on corruption, and I ran a survey experiment to understand whether citizens trust government more when they see that higher levels punish lower levels for corruption. And what the data say is that information about more effective punishment of corruption makes citizens trust government less. And it's statistically significant, really strong relationship. And it's not until we do field work that we understand that this treatment not only makes the punishment of corruption more salient, but also increases citizens' beliefs about the frequency of corruption. And it's these kinds of discoveries that fieldwork make possible. So, you know, I think that what I encourage everybody to remember is that we often think that we do research to collect data that help us answer the questions that we have. That data gives us answers to the questions, but fieldwork is important. It's essential, really, because it gives you data about your questions.
That's great. I want to thank all of you. Those were succinct and different and all super useful. One of the things in the chat was, gee, I wish we could also hear from them on what we shouldn't do in field work. I guess that's going to come up in how to do field work. Maybe we want to save that for that question in the chat. What are the things you definitely don't want to do? I think Susan would say don't record, but we'll see what else happens. So I'm going to pass it over now to my colleagues Dan Mattingly and Wang Yuhua, who are going to moderate the what we call the conversation, the first conversation on why field work, and I'll let them do the introductions of panelists and get going. So I will see you after that.
Great, thanks Melanie, and thanks to all the panelists. So welcome to, I guess, conversation 1 on why field work. So we have 4 panelists who are all practitioners who use field work, and my co-moderator, Yuhua Wang, who's associate professor in the Department of Government at Harvard, who is also author of Tying the Autocrat's Hands, which itself uses field work. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the 4 panelists, and then we have some questions from me and Yuhua, but of course, please keep questions coming in the Q&A function. We'll try to take them as they come. We have on this panel Jean Oy, who's William Haas Professor of Chinese Politics at Stanford University. Jean is author of, among other books, State of Peasant in Contemporary China, Rural China Takes Off, most recently Fateful Decisions. Also, Yizhe Ding, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh, and is the author of the forthcoming book, The Performative State, as well as a great article in World Politics that just came out called Performative Governments that everyone should check out. Diana Fu, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, author of Mobilizing Without the Masses, which won the Lubert Award for the best book in comparative politics. And then John Yasuda, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins, who's the author of On Feeding the Masses. So the first question that we have for the panel is, especially now when the field seems to reward quantitative work, and we have a lot of data on China already, why do we want to do field work at all? So I thought maybe we could just kind of go down the list of panelists, and starting with Jean, to answer this question. We'll keep an eye also on the Q&A, the chat function. Jean, it looks like you're still muted.
Yes, sorry. First, I want to thank the organizers. This is great. And I'm so happy that you just sort of came out and said, yes, you're all in favor of field work. Not surprisingly, I am a great believer in field work. And I just like to start out by maybe going back and looking at, when field work started, like all of our teachers, the previous generation, they did field work because, well, back then field work was going to Hong Kong. We couldn't even go to China. And so the reason that people like, Ado Barnett, Mike Oxenberg, for the Michigan Mafia here, and Ezra Vogel, they did field work because they knew so little about China, almost nothing about China, the organization, personnel. So obviously, their question is, so why should you do it now? There's so much data. But I think that the first panel actually said a lot of it. And even though we have a lot of data, there is still so much that we don't know. And the reason why I say that, I think that Lily, she's got some great, these, I don't know what I don't know, and things like this, and this is very true. But I also think that we know a lot about the institutions. We certainly have a lot of information about various rules, regulations, but particularly for the institutions in a place like China, the institutions are the same. And this, I want to just go back and talk about the Zoping project. We went back there for decades. And so, the last volume, the one that Melanie, is in, we found out that these institutions, which look the same on the outside, actually operate in a very different fashion. But you never would have known that unless you went in and actually did the interviewing and talked to people about what they actually did, what they are doing now as opposed to what they did before. And even in the the organization department that Melanie did research on, she finds that they're acting in a very different way. So I think that in many ways, particularly given what Xi Jinping is doing, there's probably a lot that we are not actually totally understanding, even though they may sort of look familiar. So there is that. And then, of course, the other reason is that we don't know what the numbers, I think the biggest problem is that we may not know what the numbers that we have are actually representing. And we don't know the process, all of these things. So I just think that it's just it's essential. There's a separate question later about whether this is a substitute or a complement. And I'll just say now it's clearly a necessary complement. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Jean. Next up is Yizhe.
Thank you so much to the organizers for all the public goods you've been providing during this pandemic and beyond. So sometimes fieldwork is necessary. So for those who need archives or to set up their RCT, going to the field is a necessity. But here I want to talk about when fieldwork is an option, that you could choose or not choose it. What are the benefits? And I'll talk about 3 of them. First, fieldwork leads to interesting puzzles and questions. So we're asked this question all the time: what is your puzzle? And I think the best way a puzzle was explained to me in grad school was that a puzzle is sometimes is something that is happening in the empirical world, in the real world, which either defies existing theories or if intuition suggests it otherwise. So fieldwork allows us to use our common sense and our intuition to identify things happening in the real world that are interesting and things that matter to our subjects as well. And secondly, fieldwork strengthens the internal validity of our theory. So a question, again, that gets raised all the time is, how does your theory travel elsewhere? How does your theory explain things outside of China, outside of your locality, and so on and so forth? But I think an unintended consequence of this helpful attention to external validity is that we now pay less attention to the internal validity of our theories. And that is to say, to what extent does our theory actually explain the case in our hands? Fieldwork allows us to obtain this by following the simple logic that the closer we are to our data, the better we know our data, the more confident we can be with the internal validity of our theory, I think, which is also what Lily was talking about earlier. And without internal validity, there is no external validity to speak of in the first place. And third, fieldwork adds ecological validity to our inference. So some scholars who conduct experiments, they might argue that field experiments are more desirable than survey experiments because field experiments are conducted in natural settings or quasi-natural settings. So by the same logic, for qualitative research, fieldwork also increases the ecological validity by situating qualitative observations in the natural settings of the empirical world. So just to sum up, fieldwork leads to interesting questions and puzzles. It increases the internal validity of our theory and increases the ecological validity of our findings. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Itza. Next is Dinah Fu from the University of Toronto.
Hi, everyone. Good to see so many familiar faces, and I'm sorry that we can't see the new faces. We can just see your names. So I want to speak specifically about a particular kind of fieldwork, which is ethnographic fieldwork. And ethnographic fieldwork is usually seen as the terrain of anthropologists. But I think that political scientists can really make use of it to strengthen our puzzles and to ask new kinds of questions, like Isa has said. And when I talk about what kinds of new questions or what kinds of value added that ethnography can bring, the number one value added, honestly, is that it's fun. It really is fun. I mean, that is if you like people, and that is if it was done before the Xi Jinping era. You are like closest you can get to an investigative journalist. You're in the field, you're following people, as you're stalking other people, you are probably being stalked by the police as well. And that might be fun for some people, might not be fun for other people. But seriously, like, when I think about the time that I was in the field, I was so stressed out about, getting my dissertation done. But now that you look back, you're like, that is a time in your life when most people are unburdened by, other kinds of duties or familiar duties or other kinds of duties. And it's a time in your life when you can actually explore knowledge and explore the world in a very raw way. And that's why I think doing fieldwork, and especially ethnography, if you're inclined to do it, is a fun thing to embark on in your life. But the second thing that is more disciplinary focused is that it forces you, or not forces you, it gives you the opportunity to discover what an ethnographer has called UPO, meaning unidentified political object, building on UFO. So unidentified political object is not a why question. It's not a what explains the variation question, because that is the kind of question that as comparativists we are taught to answer, right? That you discover a variation and then you go and explain what explains this variation. Well, sometimes that is the most interesting question to ask, and sometimes it's not. So in my case, the variation question that I could have asked was, why do labor organizations in China look different from labor organizations down south? That could have been the route that I chose to pursue. But what I thought was more interesting of a question to pursue was actually the what question and the how question. And those two combined can be very useful in expanding the field of inquiry, right? And so the what question was, what exactly were these organizations that but very few people had paid attention to, because they are simply just, the N is too small. There's like less than 100 of them across China. What exactly were they? How do you characterize them? What is the characterization of the relationship with the state? And then the how question that took a long time in the field of stalking people over a long period of 18 months was, how did they mobilize? How do people mobilize when they are not allowed to? And that is not it's not a why question. It's not why they mobilize, it's how they mobilize. And when you ask a question like that, you're contributing to the field in a different way by expanding that field of inquiry. And I don't want to talk too much about that, but I always tell my students, because I'm a big fan of James Scott, I always tell my students, like, if James Scott was like a grad student today writing, weapons of the week, I don't know what kind of questions he would get. Probably be like, how can you claim that your study is valid because it's based on one single village in Malaysia? It's not even a village in China. Okay, it's a village in a South Asian country that is not as important as China. One little village called like Sindaka with like 200 something households. Why is your study even valid? And the answer to that is because he studied a small village in a big moment. He studied a big phenomenon. He was able to use his study of his deep knowledge of what went on to study the evolution of class relations in a big moment of change. And I think that's what ethnographic field study, and that's what asking these what and how questions contributes to, is that it basically helps you, it helps us as political scientists to be able to build theory and not just test theory. So I'll just end it. Oh, and one last thing, if you're interested in learning more and reading more about sort of how to think about asking different questions, I'm currently editing a special issue for CPS that looks at the question of how we go beyond why questions. And there's a series of excellent articles in there, not in China studies, but from other fields that look at these kinds of questions. And I would encourage you to look at that. Okay, I'm done.
That's great. Thanks, Diana. I'm excited to see that special issue of CPS. Last, we have John Yasuda from Johns Hopkins.
Hi, folks. It's good to see so many friendly faces. So 3 points, and I just want to hit my marks in the next 2 minutes. So the first one is sort of the internal lives of your informants. The second sort of group of comments deal with coming to terms with lies. And the third is sort of dealing with the problems of distance if you're not actually conducting research there on the ground. So I talk to a lot of regulators. I spend most of my time trying to get access to regulators. So everything that Andy was talking about, just the nightmare of just trying to secure an interview, I'm very familiar with it. But I think fieldwork really sort of enhances your ethnographic sensibility. This is something Simmons and Smith kind of talk about, but it's this idea about trying to understand how regulators actually make sense of their world and incorporating their attempts to make meaning out of context. So fieldwork is not just about bringing in context, it's about how your informants are processing that context. I've had a number of situations in which my informant would all of a sudden turn to me and just say, 你不理解国情, right? That horrible moment where you're applying whatever thought you have about how regulatory governance is supposed to work and seeing how they fit the bill. And they're trying to then explain to you how they interpret it, and that's important. In terms of coming to terms with lies, this is something Yuhua and I were chatting about just recently. And it's this general sense that the sort of bias is really getting, it's a huge problem in our interviews. And I think it's interesting because the lies themselves are actually interesting, right? The lies themselves are in fact data. You shouldn't disregard them. You should try to incorporate them and understand them. Leanne Fujii has this sort of nice typology of various types of lies that are interesting: rumors, inventions, denials, evasions, and silences. So all of this is data. Read her article on this because it's much better. But I had this bizarre experience talking to a vice director of the Shanghai Stock Exchange recently, and he wanted to talk about Marxism and the inherent problems of a capitalist financial system while we were looking over the trading floor. It was bizarre. You read the room, it's interesting. And finally, the sort of third interesting point is sort of the problems of distance. And I think, certain technologies and databases highlight different types of activities and sort of obfuscate others. So we really have to think about what we're being shown and how we are being managed, right? And the one nice thing about Fieldwork is you're there, so you're responding to how you're thinking, how you think you're being, certain types of data are being presented to you, and you can reflexively respond to this. And it creates opportunities for re-engaging your material, but you can only really do this in person. I think it's really hard to do this, thousands of miles away. It's helpful to sort of see and get a sense of how that's developing. So those are my three sort of why Fieldwork, how I think it's been helpful.
Yes, thanks everyone. I've been really enjoying this conversation. I want to ask a question that is on the mind of a lot of graduate students, and I get asked about this question a lot by the graduate students. That is the opportunity costs of doing field work. So say, for example, I'm in my third year or fourth year in graduate school, and then my friend, John Smith, in the same year with me, and then, I will go to China, next year. I'll spend 1 year or even 2 years in China. And then my friend, John Smith, will stay on campus and then, choose to work on a paper. And then when I come back, for example, 1 year later, I get a bunch of fieldwork notes. And then my friend John Smith has a PSR paper. And then by the time we're on the market, he will probably have a very high probability of getting a job compared to me, right? And then I get a lot of insights. I know a lot of things happening in China, but then I probably don't have publications by the time in my 5th year. So I just wonder, how would you convince a graduate student who has such concerns to do field work in China and then sacrifice a year, to write the paper? Can I put you on the spot, Jean, again? Talk about this.
Well, from my perspective, I guess, because if this is my student, I'm the advisor, I would strongly encourage them. And I think that, it's tough because, you pointed out the trade-offs, but I would hope that the student, through the training that I would have provided and looking at, the what are considered some of the strongest works in the field, I think that the student would realize that those that are doing well, already doing well, are people that actually have combined and paid that cost and gone out and done the field work. So it's sort of delayed gratification, but I think that the students that I have had, including some on this panel, they did pay that cost, but I think that their work has paid off. So that's all I have to say about that. At this point.
Thank you so much, Jean. Can we go to Isa?
Sure.
What do you think about this, Isa?
So cost-benefit analysis aside, my view is that scholars are people who are driven by their different personalities and approaches. So usually people who want to do field work will do it anyway. And then people who don't want to do it won't do it because they don't like it, and maybe that's fine. Some people like to travel and others are house cats, and maybe they have parenting responsibilities. And, like Diana, I find it to be fun, which is why I do it. So it's not really a cost I'm paying, but a benefit I'm gaining through doing field work. It's enjoyable. I like being in the field because, again, that's how I find all my research questions and my topics. And also, it's a matter of taste as much as it is, caused by these cost concerns. And I think for us, all we can do is to provide our students a comprehensive methodological training while helping them do the best project using their favorite methods and cases. But I think you're right that it is something that involves high opportunity cost, which I think I obviously sympathize with grad students who can't do field work, but I think what we could do is to help them find funding for field work. So if you have funding for an additional a year or two, then you can do field work. And I don't think it will work against you on the job market if you graduate in 7 years vis-a-vis 5 years, for instance.
Great, thank you so much, Isa. Diana, do you have anything?
Yeah, so I think this question assumes that we're all rational actors, and I'm not a rational actor. I mean, I spent 18 months in the field. That is not a rational choice. I mean, if I had been thinking about opportunity cost, I don't think I would have been there for that long. Having said that, I do agree with Isa that, like, if you don't like talking to people and you hate traveling, then don't do fieldwork because you're going to be miserable out there. Fieldwork is hard, and you get there and you just feel lost every day. And like, I just started doing yoga in the field because I'm like, that's the one constant that I have in my life that I can sort of hook onto as I'm waiting for things to pan out. And so that's the first thing. But the second thing, I want to maybe expand this a little bit to ask. I mean, we're sort of talking as if we all have the choice to go back to the field, and as if the field is just as open as it was before. And the reality on the ground is that it's not. When I went back a couple of years ago to do field work on a different project, it was not fun. I was super stressed out, and I was super worried about getting my subjects in trouble, getting myself in trouble, maybe my family in trouble. I mean, so the field work, the cost of field work is no longer just about time and about, publishing 1 year behind John Smith. No, it's about risks that you're taking, both to yourself and as well as to your subjects. So on that, I think that there's a couple of things that I've been advising students to do. One is that if you're working on a topic that is just way too sensitive to do in the field, directly, you can think about doing what is now, called like, digital ethnography, or, I mean, that's a very specific term, but a lot of us have been doing sort of, other ways to access data besides like actually being physically there in person. The other thing to do is basically to do field work outside of China. And a lot of people, like Andy, you could probably talk about this, right? That you're not necessarily, you can study China not being in China. I mean, especially now that China is so global. So there's other there's creative ways to think about field sites. And it's very, and I think that the constraints we face are very real in terms of the costs and benefits, like from a personal security side of whether or not to do and what kind of field work that you're doing in China. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Diana. You brought up a really important point. I think we'll talk more about this in the second panel, but I want to follow up maybe after John answered this question. I want to follow up on the security question because it's really important, I think. So John, so you're much better than John Smith, John Yasuda. You're John Yasuda. So how would you say to the graduate students who want to follow the John Smith?
Okay, so I think John Smith aside, I'm really glad Diana brought up the point about just the exhaustion. Like, so in terms of the other costs to this, it's the emotional and sort of physical exhaustion that fieldwork brings, and sort of the demoralizing aspects of just not getting your interviews and things not turning out well. So the costs are huge. The opportunity costs are huge. I think one of the big things, and this is, I don't know if I should be sort of showing the inside of the curtain of like faculty deliberations on candidates, but there's always a sneaking suspicion if someone doesn't do enough field work and is a China scholar, do they really know China? Like that question pops up over and over again. And I think this is where, again, thinking about the benefits is that if you spend enough time there and you are getting the interviews and you are meeting people, you kind of tick that box, right? It's not enough, but I think it helps in some respects. Because if you gather around China scholars, especially like the big kahunas, many of the ones that are here, like dinner is like trading stories, war stories, right? I always have enjoyed listening to them. That's also kind of how I feel like a sort of a sociology of our grouping of China scholars is that's how we build our kind of coherence and sort of solidarity with each other about sort of sharing the challenges that we've had in the field together. So there's kind of that, I guess, that I would mention that you need to do it because of this sort of solidarity point. But I think when I look at my own work, it was also just because I had to do it. There was no other choice, right? I was working on food safety. There's no real information on food safety at that point in time. I didn't even know what indicator to collect on. If I wanted to do sort of a nice large end piece, I didn't know what to look for, and the only reason I get anything is by talking to someone who would tell me which indicators I could trust. And then also at the time, my cohort at Berkeley, everybody was fascinated by Lily's work on informal institutions. We were going absolutely crazy about, and we all wanted to find our next informal institution. But the thing about informal institutions, and that what Lily mentioned, was you can't really find them ex ante. You find them in the field. And so it's sort of necessity, really. So it's not, John Smith can put his APSR article together, and that's great. But, we're in a different game. We're doing, different sort of things.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to follow up on one of the points that was brought up during the conversation. Also, I think Yongfeng Tang in the chat also mentioned this. That is, we are facing an increasingly hostile climate for researchers, especially foreign researchers from the U.S. I think on both fronts. One is people in China are increasingly careful now, right? When they talk to us, they're really careful now, and then it means that we are really getting bad quality data, right? That is what they tell us is very different from what they told us 10 years ago, for example. So that's the data quality issue, but also safety issue, for them and also for us, right? When we talk to people, we get them into trouble. Sometimes we get ourselves into trouble. So given the current political climate, I guess the question again is why fieldwork? Why fieldwork now? Why do we need to do fieldwork now in China, to go to China, for example, under the certain political climate? So Jean, I'm sorry, I have to put you on the spot again. Can
I? Yes, I think I think the points that were made are very important. The doing field work now is much more difficult. There in the Diana, particularly the type of work she does, I can imagine why she would feel threatened. But obviously, most of us have not been able to go back to China. Last time I was in China was in December of 2019. So, but at that point, it was still possible to do field work, and again, it is all that much more important because in doing it, you can sort of figure out what actually is going on as opposed to what one reads in the press. But at the same time, the way to do that, I think, is that, for me, I really went to people that I have known the longest. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons for doing field work, because these contacts, these ties you build up over time. And then these are people you trust, people who will speak frankly to you, who will then give you some insights that you will not be able to get otherwise. And the other thing is that I think it is still possible to do field work if you have Chinese colleagues that they're willing to cooperate with you, so you do work together. And so that includes being able to go out into places that you probably wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So I think increasingly that this may be the way to go, that we almost have to, at least for a lot of the different topics. But I think it's all the more essential, even though it's all the more difficult.
Thank you so much. I think Dory has a two finger maybe on this.
I don't think anybody exactly said this, which is that by having been in conversations with people many times, things come up, and I feel that I understand why quantitative work, the questions asked, the answers supposedly found, are wrong, because people don't understand the context. They don't understand what the things really mean that they think they've tabulated somehow. So I haven't done interviews for a few years, but when I'm sent journal articles, I often find that they don't really know what they're talking about with the quantitative data.
Thank you so much, Dory. Dana, can I ask you to comment on this, because you are doing really fantastic fieldwork, but also on a very sensitive topic. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, well, I don't do that field work anymore. That's the sad truth, is I following my last very stressful time in the field, I just decided, you know what, I got to lay low for the moment, because I don't want to be putting people at risk, and I don't want to put myself at risk. And I saw there's some people in the audience members that are, especially if you're a Chinese national yourself, like your risk profile is even higher than for you. It's not just about not getting a visa back to China, but it's about your families, right? So I think that if you are going to the field, however, and you go in the field, you don't have to do ethnography. There's field experiments, all kinds of stuff, or more sort of short spurts of field work for interviews, targeted interviews, empirical positivist interviews, all kinds of interviews you can still do. I think for those things, it was very, very helpful to just get a really good sense of where the red lines are by talking to the people on the ground. I think, Susan, you're absolutely right in that it doesn't matter if they're at Tsinghua or Beida. It doesn't matter if they're at the lower tier institutions. They're the people that are closest to the subjects that you're studying. You got to get a sense from them where the red lines are, and just constantly be in touch with them, constantly be taking cues from them. But even then, there can be just things can go wrong. I'll give you a very brief example. Last time when I was in the field, I was interviewing this very low level official, like the Women's Federation, super low level, super low key, nothing nothing politically sensitive, so I thought, and it was introduced by somebody who was a local contact. So I was like, this, our conversation was a little bit, I could tell she wasn't the interview wasn't that comfortable, but I didn't think I was asking them any questions that were, particularly sensitive. And about halfway through the interview, I get this call. From the contact that had introduced me to the person I was interviewing, and the call was like, "Get out of there now, just leave now." And I was so stressed and shocked, and I didn't know what was going on, and so I left, and I never really got a clear explanation of what happened. And that's the one thing in China, you don't really know what happened, right? It's not transparent to you. And so there's always that risk of you go in the field, you think you're doing the right thing, you got the local contacts, you got the interviews, and then something like that happens and you just got to pull out. And I think that the best of, the advice I give to my students when you're facing that kind of stuff, just pull out. That's all you can do.
Thanks, Diana, for sharing this. You should write a book, maybe, several years later from now, how to get out. That'd be a great book to read. So Jin, you have, your hand is up.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say, I don't think any said this, but the interviewing is always really an art, and regardless of when you're doing the interview, but I think particularly now, it's important to try to package your project in as unsensitive of a manner as possible, and sort of in a very positive way, in a way that seems that could align with the continued economic growth or whatever. But obviously, some topics are more suited to that than others. But I think that is something that students really need to learn. But obviously, some I think would be what Diana was describing. That's I think that there is a clear red line, but there's a lot of other topics that seem to still be, doable.
And next we have Andy. Go ahead, Andy.
Super quick. I wanted to, as usual, agree with Jean. When I was doing my dissertation research, there were two bureaucracies that were in competition with one another, but they were doing it on the down low. And so back in those days, we would fax our interview protocols to the office that we wanted to meet with. And I said that this was the then technical quality technical supervision bureau, the Zhiliang Jishu Jianduju. And on my interview protocols, I had a bunch of questions regarding trademark enforcement, and they would not respond beyond just simply saying no. And it dawned on me that in fact they didn't want to be seen as competing over trademark enforcement with the people who were actually charged with doing it. As soon as I removed it from the interview protocol, they were like, "Yeah, come on in, we're happy to talk." So it could be something that you're not even aware of, that you're doing wrong. So just there's lots of wrinkles.
Great, thanks so much. And so there's only 2 minutes left for this panel, so I wanted to give each of the panelists about 30 seconds for concluding thoughts. If you want to either just give concluding thoughts, or if you want to pull a question from the Q&A that you'd like to answer, you're welcome to. I'd like to go in reverse order this time, so we'll not put Jean on the spot first, but put John on the spot for this.
I think it's interesting, Melanie's question about the born in China / no China question, those people who've lived there for a long time.
Can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Hello? Can you hear me? So I wasn't born in China, but I grew up in Hong Kong for a good 15, 18 years. So, I mean, the one thing that you realize, I think, is that you still need, when you don't really know your context very well when you're growing up there. I think some ethnographers talk about home blindness. And so you really need to sort of think about the benefits of sort of, the fact that you do know China in this intimate way, you have these networks. This is all presents, should present itself as an opportunity for you. Of course, like what Diana is saying, it places you at risk as well, but you have these resources and networks that other people just don't have, and that sort of access is the game, and it's also unfair, but it's how it works. And so for my own research, I mean, I've been trying to run away from finance all my life because that was what my family did. But now I get to use those networks, and I appreciate it. But I don't, so just return to the field with a different type of gaze, I guess.
Yeah. John was on a great episode of the Pickingology podcast with Jude Blanchett talking about the background for the next book project. Ita Ding.
I thought you were going to say John was on a great episode of some other show, but so I can briefly touch upon the two other questions given to me. One is, what's the value for those who were born in China who know China? I think the answer is you can always know China better, even as a Chinese person. I think that goes without saying. And then, is fieldwork a substitute or complement for quantitative analysis? And I think this question is interesting because I think in the literature on mixed methods research, the field started out from nested analysis, Lieberman, early 2000s. And then the standard approach was large N to small n nested. But the methodology literature quickly kind of moved on to questioning whether nested analysis is even feasible and how much more inference validity it gives us. So then many have argued that better inference may be obtained using small n to large N approach. And then those of you who are interested in this can look into Ingo Rockfin's critique of nested analysis and recent publications on these issues. So I think the using this example to answer the question, which is, to describe the benefit of small n to large N, is to say that quantitative analysis in this case complements qualitative research and not vice versa. So that's another way of thinking about this question.
Great, thanks, Ita. Diana Fu.
Yeah, I guess I've said mostly everything I wanted to say. I did see a question from Kyle about how does fieldwork ultimately show up in your research outputs? And I think each of us on this panel would have a different answer for that. But just my own personal answer is it shows in 100% of the work. It's not just about curating a couple of quotation marks. It's the whole interpretation of how people see the world, and you're making sense of how they make sense of the world, if that makes any sense. And then I also do think that fieldwork can complement other data gathering projects. It can complement quantitative projects, and it can complement a lot of kind of different types of qualitative projects as well. One last thing about just the practicalities of when it might be advisable to resume fieldwork in China. Don't know. I think that it's not looking good. And with the national security law in Hong Kong, it's not just, there was another question about like, if you're a foreigner, you might be, how do you avoid being seen as a spy or whatever? Well, it's not really a foreigner issue. Now under the national security law, anyone, anywhere in the world can be charged for subversion, right? So it's not a foreigner problem anymore. So I don't know how, I think our field still has to continue the discussion we had, I think now 3 years ago, was it, Jean, that you hosted us at Stanford? I can't even remember how many years ago it was, but we had a big discussion, I remember, about what to do as the field's moving forward in a context that just seems to be tightening. And I think that those conversations should continue.
Great, thanks. And last word to Jean Oy.
Well, I'm very happy that there are alternative sources of information, but I think that interview, for me in any case, I love it because this is how I learn, and it's like layer upon layer. And so like one interview, is on top of the other, and then I the first interview, I get some, and then I go to the second and third. And by the time the fifth and sixth, I've gotten so much more information, and it just opens up, I think, different layers for me of China. And I think that, and hopefully the students will learn to really love it like so many of us on this panel do, because I think that will then really inform and enrich their writing and our understanding of China. So I do hope we can continue. And believe it or not, there are, even in this very tight circumstances, there are organizations in China that are reaching out to universities in the US, including places like Stanford, offering to do cooperation that includes fieldwork. We'll see what that actually is like, but that is what they are offering. So we'll see once we get back. Hopefully we'll be soon.
Great. Well, thanks so much. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank our four panelists for this really fantastic discussion, and now hand it back over to Melanie.
Hey, great and good management of timing, panelists and moderators. So now we're just going to move on to how to do fieldwork, conversation 2. And we have so many questions that have piled up in the chat about how to do fieldwork. But if you have other questions, that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask them. So without further ado, let me hand it over to my 2 colleagues from Wisconsin-Madison, Go Badgers, and Ho Yue from Penn. So Reed, Lei, and Ho Yue, take it away.
Thank you, Melanie, and thanks to the panelists in the first panel. So Ho Yue and I, Reed Lei, will chair this session together. We will have 4 distinguished panelists in our panel, and I will hand over to Ho Yue to introduce them and pose some general questions, and we'll pose those questions from the audience to our panelists later.
Great. Thank you, Reed. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuhua. I'm from University of Pennsylvania. So we have 4 great panelists for the next hour, and they all have very extensive fieldwork experiences covering a wide range of research topics on China. And as you will see, they also use quite different methodologies that we will hear about. And Reed and I have invited our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes each and offer graduate students and other scholars some advice, tips on strategies of doing fieldwork in China, especially now when the political climate is tightening and a lot of the topics are considered potentially sensitive. Further, we would like to hear your thoughts on how your own identities affect how you do fieldwork. What are some of the pros and cons, where you are from? And finally, we want you to offer some thoughts about challenges and opportunities of doing fieldwork in the COVID era. And one attendee already asked how to re-enter China. So I guess I'll throw it out there as well. And after this opening speeches, we will answer questions from the audience. So next, let's follow the order listed on the program. First of all, we have Professor Mary Gallagher from the University of Michigan, who has done very influential work on labor, media, and more generally on law and politics in China. So I think Mary is really the best person to comment on studying sensitive topics in China. And the one audience already asked, what is the advice you would give for foreign national researchers who work on sensitive security issues, for example, military technology, for whom interview work might be mistaken for espionage? Mary, difficult question, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ho Yue. So should I first do my little blurb and then answer the question? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk just briefly about some thoughts about positionality and about your role as an interviewer. The title of my talk is Positionality is a Bitch, which I have discovered even more so from doing research about China in the United States. I also wanted to just say something about the earlier discussion that one of the interesting things that's happened with fieldwork, which is a really important justification for fieldwork, is that in the 1990s and probably into the early part of this century, the qualitative-quantitative methodological divide was also a divide about fieldwork. So if you were qualitative, you did fieldwork, and if you were quantitative, by and large, you didn't. You took databases and large N data that was already collected by somebody else, and you did analysis on that. That's not really the case anymore in comparative. Most quantitative methodologists, people who are doing survey experiments or field experiments, they're all doing field work. So in some ways, I think that divide has actually helped the justification for field work, no matter what your methods are. And in my remarks about positionality, I'm mainly talking about non-elite interviews, so talking to people who are sort of normal people, lao bai xing, or the masses, or whatever you want to talk about them and who they are in the United States. And there might be some important differences in terms of elites versus non-elites. One thing I've realized from talking to workers, both in China and in the United States, is that we are outsiders. we are outsiders wherever we go. We are nerds and we are weird and we don't talk in the same language. So unless you want to have really uncomfortable fieldwork experiences, figure out what the differences are between you and your population that you're interested in. So in thinking about this difference between me and, say, a worker, whether they're Chinese or American, for China, the big difference is my nationality and my language, right? I'm not a native speaker of Chinese, and I'm also an American citizen. And those can be negatives, right? And I'll talk later, or maybe if we can talk about the question about sensitive research when you're a foreigner. But there also are benefits in some ways of being a little bit more distant from your fieldwork experience, the experience that your informants are going through. And in some ways, I think that that talking to somebody who is so different, there's a kind of sense of venting. Like, people are going to tell you a lot because they don't associate you with any of their social connections or networks, and that can be a benefit. Another interesting thing about being sort of distant from your population is that they can make comparisons. If they bring up a comparison to you or your society, that can be really illuminating for how they are thinking about their own. And that always came up in talking to Chinese workers about the Chinese legal system. Although often their sense of the American legal system was unfortunately from things like Law and Order and things that they had seen on TV, which may not be representative. For me, doing research in the United States, the biggest problems have been both class and partisanship. So obviously the difference in class is really severe. And I was talking to an African-American worker of a retired worker in Ypsilanti last year, just before COVID. And he was telling me about the impact of the closure of the automotive plant had on his community. His community is 10 miles away from where I live, right? And what he said to me is like, you can't understand what I'm talking about. Like, you can't even possibly understand what we've gone through. And that has nothing to do with my nationality. That has nothing to do with language, right? We're speaking the same language. And then secondly is partisanship. So partisanship is a big divide in the United States, and it can make it very difficult to talk to people when they perceive you as, sometimes the enemy, or, that's somebody who, is so embedded in a different political reality. So I'm saying that partly not because we're talking about interviewing Americans, but because I realize that a lot of the people doing research on China now are Chinese, right? You are Chinese natives or Chinese citizens doing research in your own country. And I have to warn you, like, do not think that they won't be the same differences. Like, partisanship probably won't be the big difference, but there will be differences and there will be divides. And you should try to think about what those might be, particularly if you are coming in with an association, right? With a Danwei that's going to have a certain connotation to the people that you're talking to. So it's been sort of illuminating for me to realize that in some ways doing research in China was different, but it wasn't necessarily more difficult than doing it in my own country. And then, so just briefly about some ideas about how I definitely agree with Diana about this idea about embedding yourself, taking the time and the work to understand the community that you're interested in, which also will mean that you probably have to be a little bit more focused on where you're doing research. Find allies and translators, and I don't mean language translators, but people who can help you make sense of the world that you're in. So often when I do interviews with automotive workers, I go with an old white guy who really likes cars because automotive workers talk a lot about cars and I get really bored, but he's super excited about cars. So it just makes it easier to have dialogue. And then just finally, don't take for granted that your positionality is easier when you're from the same country. That in some ways can really complicate it. For Huyue's question about sensitive research as a foreigner, and I have not done research in China on a sensitive topic since 2017 or so. It clearly was difficult, and it's only gotten more so. And I would argue that if you're doing research on a sensitive topic involving the military or anything really related to elite politics, I might not do it in China. I might do it remotely. I don't think you can be assured of your safety, and I certainly don't think you can be assured of the personal safety of your informants. So, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mary. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of the points about positionality and how we belong to different circles when we are back to the Q&A. But next up, we have Professor Lizhi, who is an assistant professor from Georgetown University, and she has done very innovative work on the digital economy. And I think you're really suited to answer this question from the audience, that is, what kind of advice about doing field work that involve business and the private sector. And Lizhi will talk about, I think, new opportunities during COVID era. Lizhi, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Yuan, and also other conference organizers for including me on the panel. I will probably talk about the opportunities to do research related to business later. First of all, I want to offer some of my ideas about fieldwork, especially the new opportunities that I see in studying Chinese politics right now. So the challenges are very real and concerning, but I also believe that there's a Chinese saying that 办法总比困难多, or translated into English, that is always there are always more solutions than there are problems. So I realized that in my advisor's generation, Chinese scholars in the U.S. initially had no access to mainland China, and they had to go to Hong Kong, interview all these peasants and workers who fled from mainland to Hong Kong and still managed to do some A-level research. So I think there are always some creative ways to get research done despite all the challenges. So the first opportunities I see is something that's already mentioned by Diana, Maria, and other scholars, which is to conduct online ethnography or cyber ethnography. When we talk about the fieldwork, we tend to think that being in China physically is important, but it's actually very important, but not always possible given the current situation. So in my opinion, field can be virtual, and especially given that China has undergone this huge digitization process, and essentially you have over 1 billion users of WeChat and other social media. So there's a great opportunity to actually connect to people in China without actually being there. Of course, conducting online ethnography doesn't mean that you scrape millions of web pages and do some fancy text analysis. You actually have to spend time every day, follow these people on social media or news portal or other Chinese sites to observe what people are talking about and what people care. You can use Weibo, WeChat, Zhihu, or if you want to understand the young generation, use Bilibili. Of course, when you see this is too risky to actually participate in the conversation, you don't have to participate, you can just observe. So I think it's very important in nowadays political climate, especially given the worsening of US-China relations. You can see that the Chinese news from the China source, from the Chinese source and English source will have very polarized idea. So actually, in order for us to get access to these both different opinions, it's actually very important to read something that's in Chinese and see how the Chinese population we're talking about. I actually personally tremendously benefited from online ethnography, even though I also spent 14 months physically in China when I was doing research on e-commerce. Because after coming back from China, I always had these questions about e-commerce. So I added my interviewees. A lot of them are peasants. A lot of them are government officials or employees from platforms. I add them as WeChat friends, so I can ask follow-up questions. And also I followed what kind of a news they share in the friends circle. That helped me greatly to keep updated with the latest changes in the field. And also I joined some WeChat groups that you essentially have, they have discussions about e-commerce research and policies every day. So I got to observe what people are actually thinking and care. So of course, there are some caveats regarding this online ethnography. For example, you have this potential information bias and self-censorship on social media. Another thing is data security that a lot of people have brought up. You have to protect yourself and the people you're messaging with. So I would say try different social media apps. Some may be more secure than others. And third is that every social media has a very different user group. Be aware of this. For example, some people are actually now using Clubhouse to listen to some of the conversations about, Xinjiang or Taiwan. But you should be aware that Clubhouse users is also a very selective group. And the second opportunity, other than online ethnography, that I can see is actually this rise of collaborative governance. In fact, in China, this is a major change, which is there's more and more public and private collaboration on the provision of governance. Since Andy is here, actually this fits into Andy's, very famous fragmented authoritarian 2.0 framework, talking about this increased political polarization in China's policy making process. In other words, you do have opportunities to meet government officials or even attend to some events held by the private firms that participate in those projects. I know that, for example, in the health sector or in surveillance sector, actual private sectors, private companies are one of the major players in those sectors. In my own case, actually, e-commerce, you see that the tech companies and e-commerce companies are collaborating with the government. So when I study e-commerce, through the introduction of people from Alibaba, I met quite a few local cadres every time in my visit to e-commerce villages. I also went to this county e-commerce summit where hundreds of county mayors actually attended, and e-commerce policy training programs that basically made me be able to meet these county officials for 3 days. That's how you can actually interact with them, because you actually spend hours or days with these people, and they're also more relaxed during that setting. But of course, the limitation here is that this only applies to very certain topics, such as something that's related to business or more commercial topics. And you also should be aware that of research ethics and the need to protect your subjects. So that is what I want to say. And I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lizhi. And I think you did provide a lot of optimism in terms of new ways of doing field work in the current climate. And next up, I would like to introduce Professor Maria Repnikova. She is an assistant professor at Georgia State University, and she has done extensive work on political communication and media in China. Now she's writing her new book on China in Africa. I'm sure she'll talk about that too. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yuhua, for the invitation, to all the panelists for organizing, and I've learned a lot already from the various insights. I wanted to kind of structure my remarks about the questions posed by Yuhua before this seminar. And first, kind of in terms of the risks, I think we all talk about the risks of domestic kind of sensitivity in terms of the crackdown and how difficult it is to research certain topics, but there's also the increasing pressure that comes from geopolitical sort of environments. China-US relations are also making research increasingly challenging, especially in terms of our identities as scholars coming from the US, regardless of whether you're a Chinese national or American, or in my case, Russian American, you're increasingly being associated with kind of the national policies of the United States government. So I've had this experience in my last research trip in China in 2019, and I found that to be kind of a new challenge, because anything I would say or ask was kind of first viewed through the lens of US policies and US-China relations. And that's something I haven't really experienced prior to this, doing research in Chinese media in 2016, 17, 14, and so forth. And the last risk, I think, or kind of emerging sort of challenge, I think, is that the research environment overall is increasingly fluid with digital sort of settings. So our research is very readily translatable into Chinese social media space. So it means that anything we write in English is also becoming kind of read widely and potentially interpreted as more sensitive than it might be intended to initially. So I think the research is very fluid, and it travels easily across boundaries and borders, which may also make visa access more risky. So those are the kind of three layers of different risks. And I want to talk about also the managing strategies, since we're talking about the how. So several strategies and several opportunities. So first of all, when it comes to strategies, I want to echo the point on kind of framing the research questions and projects in a relatively or as depoliticized way as possible, especially in the current climate. And an example from my recent project under Still in the Sea era was looking at kind of the decline of Chinese journalism in the Sea period, and recently just published an article with a co-author Ke Changfang just came out today looking at this particular issue. And we framed this question not so much about political pressures, but about the pressures on media industry. And I think this also kind of speaks to Lizhi's comment about business and political relations and kind of trying to understand politics through the business angle. So we asked questions about this kind of problems of industry and how journalism is declining and dying and how it's transitioning online and what the government is doing about it, finding that the government is both failing and succeeding in different ways. But the political issues of censorship, of propaganda, and self-censorship came out throughout our conversations. So the political kind of matters still pierce through the questions that were sort of depoliticized. So I would really strongly encourage framing questions in a much more kind of subtle way. And I think that's also an art that helps, as Mary mentioned, to kind of translate some of your questions with the help of collaborators in China, with our colleagues and co-researchers who can help kind of reshape and use the right language and make it appear as, I think, more relatable to your interviewees. I think the second issue we haven't talked about quite as much, but it's about intensive and deliberate protection of data. So that's something that I'm not an expert in, but I'm trying to be much more deliberate about that. So for instance, going to China in recent years, always taking an empty laptop. I don't bring anything that's kind of containing data from my projects or anything else I'm writing about here in the US, but also trying to be very careful about destroying physical notes or copying them, not leaving any data on the computer desktop while I'm interviewing people. So just being much more cautious about what are you storing in your hotel room and your Airbnb, and how do we protect data? I think we don't talk about this enough. So I think that's something that is really important as we continue to hopefully return to China. The third, I think, kind of coping mechanism here, and that's something to debate as well, is whether or not we need to be more formal about kind of our research affiliations in China. From my experience, I've done a lot of this very informally, often going on, all kinds of visas and staying and affiliating myself in an informal manner. But last visit, again, 2019, I was told actually by Beida to come informally. But when I did arrive there, my informal visa was not accepted, and I was told that I'm not going to be able to get the ID at Beida and I can't even enter campus. So rules are quickly shifting, and my impression was that nowadays, next trip has to be much more formalized. And again, that also presents opportunities and risks, because it's more formalized. It also might mean that you have more pressure or kind of communication from your host about how to do the research. And the last mechanism, I think, is more about, more self-reflection and awareness about, again, our positionality in this field. And for me, I think it was about my identity and, that as an American citizen, something that I haven't really thought that much through before this kind of deteriorating relationship between China and the US. I often got away with saying that I'm a Russian immigrant and all kinds of relatable stories, but this really stopped working. So I think I'm much more, aware and cautious now that this kind of stories might not work, and I have to be a lot more upfront and honest and just open about, the understanding of the kind of political gravity is affecting my fieldwork. The last, minute or so, I want to introduce briefly some opportunities that I see in this climate. Lizhi already covered digital ethnography, and I think that's a very important area, and Diana mentioned as well. I've published quite a bit on using this methodology, and it's very widely used also in communication studies. It's actually considered to be one of the core methods, as opposed to kind of a secondary or less preferred one. So I would strongly recommend some readings on that from the communications field. But the other opportunity I want to highlight here is working on China outside of China. And I don't see this as a weakness. I actually see this field of global China as really dynamic, exciting, and could very much benefit from the insights of comparative politics scholars. In fact, most scholars now who work on this are coming from sociology, such as Qingguang Li at UCLA, and many anthropologists. But political scientists thus far are not quite as, engaged in exploring this topic of global China. And what does this specifically mean? Well, global China includes a variety of topics, including studying the relationship between Chinese diaspora and the CCP, China's external propaganda, soft power, the development and kind of outreach of Chinese SOEs, and many, many other topics. Increasingly, as already was mentioned, China is global. So understanding domestic China and global China are not two separate fields, they're completely fused. And I think the insights of comparative politics come really handy in trying to study global China. For example, the central-local relationship, kind of dynamics of fragmentation play into the relationship between provincial and national level diplomacy that I've been looking at in my project on soft power. When it comes to state-business relations and SOE expansion, we can't really understand that without understanding domestic Chinese context. Labor regime and how labor-state relations play out impacts how they play out at Chinese companies overseas, as C.K. Lee has shown, I think, beautifully in her work on Zambia. Public opinion studies in understanding Chinese nationalism, wolf warrior diplomacy, and aid policies are, I think, also really exciting topics. I think the politics of censorship and propaganda domestically shape how propaganda works externally. And global insights on domestic issues, I think, also help us understand China, on global issues help us understand China domestically. For example, how is China viewed? How is the China model, so to speak, understood by external audiences, something I've been studying in the context of Ethiopia. So I think there's really a lot of exciting areas, but also in some ways more accessible areas in thinking about China outside its borders. And I'll be happy to talk more about the sensitivity of that as well. It's by no means an easy thing. It also requires all the things we talked about: immersion, understanding, your potential audience, significant preparation time, potentially studying new languages. So it's very hard, but I think it's exciting, fun, and also very fruitful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I would like to remind the audience that Maria speaks very many languages, and it's very difficult for some of us to imitate, but that was great. Last but not least, we have Saul Wilson, who is finishing up his PhD degree in government at Harvard. And Saul has done very exciting participant observation work at an anonymous government department and a 事业单位. So let's keep it that way. So take it away.
Thank you, Yuhua. And I want to start by going back to the question that came up at the beginning, which is why to do field work. And the argument I would make for doing field work is that it's our attachment to reality, and that a lot of what we do in academia is about trying to describe reality, and the act of doing field work is our opportunity to really interact with reality personally and get a sense for how things work on the ground. And so that has some implications for methodology, and probably relatively heterodox implications for methodology, which is that if we can get a sense of what's going on the ground, it doesn't necessarily matter if we did it in the most rigorous way. And so part of the purpose of field work is just to give us our sort of basic, in the words of Bob Bates, bullshit detector. And another purpose is to do the sort of much more rigorous research component. And for the purpose of sort of getting our attachment to reality, the most important thing I've found is simply not to say no when offered fieldwork opportunities. Most of the access I have gotten has come from places I would never have expected it to come from. And obviously you should say no if it's unethical or immoral, but as long as it is appropriate and above board and provides you with some insight into how China is operating, saying no simply because it isn't the most rigorous form of field work or isn't the form that you had in mind originally is really a missed opportunity. So I want to talk a little bit about identity, although I think Mary covered almost everything that I would have said. But the most important thing in my mind is really to be cognizant of who you are and what you're doing there. And part of that goes to what Andy said at the beginning, which is to be cognizant of the fact that you are essentially a guest, and to not expect things that are unrealistic. All of the fieldwork I've done has been in the Xi Jinping era, and it's been sort of interesting to hear stories of the pre-Xi era when it sounds like people could walk into government offices and have all of the documents thrown at them. That hasn't been my experience in the Xi era, but it wouldn't be my expectation of a government office in the United States either. And sort of coming into these places with an expectation of what one would reasonably expect, instead of expecting that they will bend over backwards to give you everything, including their confidential documents. And relatedly, it's important not only to be cognizant of your identity, but to attempt to leverage it. So for me as a sort of obviously American, one of the most useful aspects of this identity has been the fact that until recently, people thought that America was one of the most successful countries in the world and wanted to learn from us. And so being able to tell people about how America worked has been really useful. And it's also forced me to go back and learn quite a bit about how America worked that I didn't know when I started studying China. So making sure that you have something that is of interest to the people you're interviewing and that you can carry on a conversation with them and not simply fire questions at them, I've found to be really helpful in getting them to feel comfortable and getting them to feel like it's a useful way to spend their time. The one last thing on identity that I would add is there was a question in the chat about whether we should bring people who are native Chinese or people who are more involved in what it is we're studying along with us when we're conducting interviews. And I would urge caution on that. My experience has been that certainly being a white American male has changed what people tell me when I do interviews, but I think that if I had taken along a Chinese colleague, it would quite possibly have shrunk what we would have been told. The Chinese colleague going independently and my going independently might get very different answers, but if we go together, we're going to get the intersection of what they're willing to tell us instead of the union of what they're willing to tell us. The last point that I want to speak to is this persistent issue of what's sensitive and what we can hope to get out of field work in the Xi Jinping and particularly in the post-COVID era. The first thing I would say is that sensitivity is often in the framing, and Jean touched on this earlier, that part of doing field work is making sure that our projects are framed in ways that appeal to the people we're interviewing. And so part of that is figuring out what types of questions the practitioners want answers to, and framing our questions in ways that our answers would also be of use to them. But in terms of sort of the more basic question of how not to get ourselves in trouble, my solution has always been to be as transparent as possible and to be a good citizen. And that means that if the government says that I shouldn't do something, I don't do it. And in particular, when it comes to things like visas and formal processes, to the maximum extent possible, following the rules so that I'm not in a position where I could reasonably be interpreted as creating trouble. But obviously none of that is a guarantee. And so there is certainly risk involved in all of this. So.
Great, thank you so much. So it's nice to hear your thoughts. And Rita and I will structure the remaining of our time in the following way. So each of us will ask a question that's specific to your work, and we're gonna open it up for audience question. So my first question would go to Mary. So many people are wondering, there are things that students are doing that you guys think are great. So we would like to know if there are things that you advise your graduate students that they should definitely not do.
Well, I mean, you know, I think if any of us, I mean, I guess all of us doing fieldwork are going through IRB, one thing you'll realize by going through the IRB process at your university is that the IRB process is not geared to protect your informants. It is there to protect the university from litigation. So it's probably also not there really to protect you either. And so that should inform you about, just by getting, you know, IRB approval for your project does not mean that you've done everything you can do to protect your informants. So I definitely agree with Saul that we should, you know, always be as formal as possible in terms of getting approvals for what we're doing. And always having, you know, and I think it can really depend, and people have talked about this earlier about what your perceived risk is, whether you're a Chinese national. I think that if you're a Chinese national or even ethnically Chinese, I think the risks to you are really much larger. Although I think with the detention of the 2 Canadians, maybe we should all be much more careful about the risk that we're willing to endure when we're in the field. But first and foremost, I think we should be attentive to our ethical responsibilities to our informants, and to do everything we can to make sure we're not putting them at risk. That's a little bit, I mean, for me, I think our metric for that should be different than say a journalist. So journalists will talk to anybody, and they love to get scoops. And so I've talked to journalists about this topic, about why they know that this person may be putting themselves at risk, and then their answer is, well, the person is an adult and they're talking to me of their free will, and so therefore I don't need to do anything more. I think that's a little bit different for foreign researchers or any researcher where you're trying to collect data on people. That it shouldn't just be that you've gotten their consent, but that they may not be fully aware of the risk environment, and it's important to make sure that we do everything we can to protect them. I'm sure there's so many more things I should say you should or shouldn't do, but I think it's hard to do like line by line. But I think just generally keeping your informants in mind, first and foremost, is most important. And that will probably also do more to protect yourself, and if you have family in China, your family members.
Thank you, Mary. On the IRB, I definitely agree with you. I think sometimes I was like, oh, my IRB approval was so easy. I wish they could have asked me a little more about, you know, certain questions. I would also like to invite others on the panel if you have anything to add on what researchers shouldn't do in the field. if anybody else has anything to add. All right, why don't we turn it to Reed?
Well, thanks. Our second question will go to Lizhi. So, given your experience working with this new phenomenon, e-commerce in China, which is not that new, but it is quite new compared to the traditional literature on the Chinese political economy, what would your suggestions be for those junior scholars who would love to conduct fieldwork and qualitative research on this new political economy phenomena like digital economy, platform economy, and so on and so forth? What would be different for these scholars who are studying these new phenomena than those more traditional topics?
Thank you for the question, Reed. First of all, let me say that I strongly encourage people to actually do research in this field because it's actually less risky than a lot of the traditional topics that we know in Chinese politics, but it's everyday politics because everyone is using WeChat or they are communicating online. Their economic interests are affected by it. So essentially, you're doing research on ordinary citizens, and the access is actually wider. And I also think it's probably less risky when you interview people about their feeling. First, let me talk about how to do research on it. In fact, there is also broader access to do research in this field because tech companies and internet firms usually have research institutes, and sometimes they will run this annual open access research program through which basically you can basically apply for it. Of course, there's a competitive, application process, and you will have to just send in a proposal and make sure that they like your project. For example, Alibaba has Alibaba Research Institute, and Financial has 蚂蚁金服研究院, which is also a research institute. Tencent has a research institute, and I believe others, JD also has it. And another advantage of doing research in this field is that they have a culture of sharing. At least when I was doing my research, I think it's very easy to actually get people to talk to me. And even for government officials who's in charge of these innovation policies that tend to be, probably because of self-selection, they tend to be more liberal and also more open-minded. So they will also openly talk about, complain about what hasn't been done or like what it was not very successful. So I do find that the interview data was quite high quality, but there's some like a risk and also difficulty with it. First of all, working on a new topic compared to some more traditional topic or established field is that you really have to start from scratch. It is very risky. You're essentially betting on two things. One, time is on your side, and the topic will be important when you get on the market. And second, you also are betting that you're actually able to pull it off. I have to say that it took me a long time to actually to realize that I can graduate with this dissertation because the whole process was too painful. I spent a whole year in the field. I visited so many villages, cities, talking to so many people, but I didn't even know like what literature my research could speak to. So it does take a lot of time for things to come together. I guess this is true for all the topics, but when you are working on something that's very new, this is especially a big obstacle. So you really need to choose a topic according to your own research, your own risk profile, and to think like also your time horizon, whether you want to do it or not. But of course, the payoff could be huge. And the second obstacle I see is that, especially in political science, usually people will ask you, where is the politics? Because usually it is more natural when people think about, technology, it's purely technology or econ. But I think it requires some creative thinking to actually tie the thing to politics, which I found reading European history actually helped me to think about e-commerce and Alibaba. So you do need to read widely, is usually outside of your home discipline, that will give you a lot of inspiration. And the third thing actually is about this research institute I was talking about. If you're a qualitative scholar, usually it's very easy to ask these research institute at internet firms to help you to set up a Fieldworks. That's the thing they really love to do. So basically they will do these introductions. It's very easy. No one is accompanying you. You can just walk there and talk to people. But if you really want to do the quantitative work as I did, it was very difficult. So basically, it's very difficult to get access to the administrative data that internet firms got. In the end, I was able to ask Alibaba to do a RCT, a field experiment for me. But that took a year of establishing relationship, and I had to persuade two vice presidents to support my research project. So you need to be very patient, and anything that involves data could be a little bit risky, because when there is a leadership turnover, say, your research project could be stopped. So that's the risk of working with a corporation. And usually you also have to sign a data agreement with them. I think one thing you want to make sure actually before signing it is that they can allow you to publish your research results, even if this results is not something they favor. Because if you actually do not preempt this risk, they can actually not allow your research to be published. So these are my thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lizhi. And our next question would go to Maria. And Maria, a lot of us in the audience, I think, are interested in your subjects, both government officials and media experts in China, and they're also starting to look at them outside of China. So I guess I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on how to access them, how to earn their trust. And you also have the STAR team pairing with Ke Chengfang, who has a lot of access in China. So for people who cannot have that kind of access, what's your advice? And do people speak differently when they're in China and outside of China?
Thank you so much, Yuan, for the questions in chat as well. When it comes to getting access to these particular groups of interviewees, whether it's media professionals or government officials, I think my biggest experience has been that it takes a long time of patience and building those networks to finally be able to kind of benefits from these sort of relationships, because it just doesn't come immediately. And as many have mentioned, the first few months, I think Andy mentioned that it might be completely kind of appear as a time sink, or you're just sort of there getting to know some of these things on a maybe more surface level and not getting quite into the depth of the interviews that you're trying to access. But over time, I found that these kind of efforts that are often very just meticulous and daily outreach from one kind of individual to another, introductions that often range outside of those groups. For example, I spoke to a lot of journalism educators before I spoke to media professionals. So my first project that I published eventually as an article was looking at journalism education and kind of the political facets of that. And that yielded a lot of connections to journalists who were guest speakers in those classes. So rather than going straight for journalism, which was much more sensitive, I went for the education kind of sphere. And I found that education is often a really interesting access point. It's much less kind of politicized, and it's often it's simply more accessible because you're coming in as a student or as an educator yourself. You get more access to individuals there as colleagues to help you. So that was for me a really helpful kind of initial route of entry. And then, of course, many journalists over time transition to other professions like PR, or they start up their own things, digital kind of startups on social media. So go kind of turning more towards Lizhi's topic as well. And oftentimes they don't end up being permanent connectors. So you end up having to meet and connect with new individuals. So it's sort of a constant process of renewal, and you can't always keep up with all of these networks. I think that's a very challenging thing, and some people keep up better than others, but I find that as your topic shifts towards other areas, it's also hard to continue to keep up with the old research kind of connections. I think others might confirm that. So I think overall, it's the kind of experience, of course, over time, patience, but also finding ways to build through other, entry points. It doesn't have to be always the exact ones that you started with. And same thing was with officials, that a lot of professors had officials as speakers, as friends, as kind of even PhD students, because they're often getting PhD on the side. So that as students, they're much more open to talk about issues than as officials. So it depends on what context, what setting you're meeting them in, and that to me was really I think very, very helpful. And when it comes to outside of China, or speaking about global China, I think there's several levels to this. On one hand, it's still quite sensitive depending on which topic you're studying, because again, the American identity comes in as a very much a disfavor here. And I'm looking at China Africa at the moment, and a lot of events, for example, in China Africa, there are many of them taking place almost daily before the pandemic. You can't attend as an American just because they don't want any Americans there. They want only Africans and Chinese. It's kind of like the new form of sort of creating bilateral channels of knowledge and production that basically disenfranchise or kind of exclude Europeans and Americans from this whole process. So that's becoming an interesting kind of challenge to cope with. and again requires many, many months of building trust and finding ways into one of those conferences where you can give a talk or serve as an educator, then and that way build your networks. So I think it really varies, and the global China sometimes is more accessible through the lens of those who are engaging with China, such as officials, who are working with Chinese officials, who are coming for trainings, people who are studying Chinese language, participating in CI, Confucius Institute projects, journalists who work for Chinese media overseas. Those are much more accessible actors or interviewees than the Chinese side of this kind of equation. And they're also very insightful and interesting. So I would strongly recommend considering that route as well.
Okay, excellent. So we have another question for Saul as well. So my question is more closely related to your identity as a graduate student, because it's very difficult, challenging to conduct fieldwork as a graduate student recently in China. And I think one of a question from our audience summarizes the question better than I do. So I'm going to raise that question to you directly. So as a graduate student, I exhausted all the social network to get access to the potential interviewees. However, still more are needed to establish the database. Is there any strategy in this situation to probably expand the data set, to find more people? How did you resolve this issue? And the following up question is that in the actual field work, our plan probably wouldn't pan out. So if we cannot get the cases as the research design expected, what will we do in that case?
So I would reiterate that the main way in which I have gotten access has been through idiosyncratic connections. I have met graduate students as an undergraduate in one case, which was extremely helpful for my doing fieldwork for my undergraduate fieldwork. I've met graduate students as a graduate student. I've met Chinese graduate students who were visiting the US and said that they had friends who could help me do fieldwork when I got back to China, and they delivered. And often I've looked at these offers as almost laughable when they're presented to me. They often come from sources where I think that there's really no way that this person can possibly have the connections that they claim to have. But I've learned to bite my tongue and find out what they can actually deliver. And by and large, they've delivered more than when professors at Chinese universities have seemed like appealing avenues to find access. And I think that's partly been because they simply have fewer competitors for that access. Your average professor at a Chinese university has plenty of people who they need to help do field work, and people who just happen to have good connections and who you stumble into in the course of your academic life or your daily life can be more eager to help because you're simply more novel. So that's my main suggestion. A second suggestion comes as well from another question that came up in the chat, which is how to deal with different types of interviewees. That it's not just that we have identities as interviewers, but that the interviewees we deal with also have very distinctive identities. And I found that particularly striking as I shifted from my original research topic as an undergraduate, looking at rural inequality within villages, to eventually now looking at urban planning and urban development. And in looking at rural areas, I found that the people I was interviewing were not particularly well connected with one another. They were often quite resistant to talking to me, and much as Mary talked about in the US case, I found that I had a quite significant class distance from the people that I was talking to, and that it required some real work for me to be able to interact with them in a way that made them feel comfortable. And then now looking at urban planning, I've found that the people I interact with everywhere from government agencies to planning institutes onto the academics are all people who are essentially my colleagues. Many of the government officials have PhDs or masters. Many of these are people who are more familiar with what it means to do a PhD perhaps than even I am. And so there's a lot of interaction there that feels more like academic interaction. And so the identity of these different interviewees can really shape the way that you have to do the field work. And so what came to mind is a potential piece of guidance and also a sort of a comfort is to think about how government officials themselves do field work in these different sectors. And when government officials do field work in the countryside, they often run into a lot of the same problems we do. which is that local governments lie to them, they misrepresent things. And this is, after all, the origin of the concept of Potemkin villages, which is that when government officials go down to look at the countryside, things often don't look the way they do in reality to villagers. And so government officials solve this problem by getting to know individual villages, having personal connections with individuals who they then can use as links to reality. And maybe it's not the most rigorous approach, but it does allow them some insight into what's actually going on. Whereas in urban planning, things are done very differently. In urban planning, people have a social network from when they went to college with other urban planners who have now gone into other types of work. And they have these social networks from going to meetings of professionals. And so thinking about the ways in which government officials do this work, and often it's something that government officials will write about in professional journals about how they're able to learn what's going on, is something that we can also take advantage of in looking for our own networks. I would add one last thing actually to this, which is that trying to be part of the community that you're studying can be particularly useful. And this is difficult if you're studying peasants, but easier if you're studying a community that has a written record and some sort of academic presence. And so for urban planning, for example, I publish in Chinese from time to time. And I find that that can be really helpful to showing that I'm sincerely interested in what the discourse is in the community I'm studying, and allowing the people I'm interviewing to know that I'm actually producing real work and that I'm not just nagging them for no purpose.
Excellent, thank you. So our panel, we and I want to raise the final question, and then we're going to really end up there. So we want to understand one question related to the research design of the fieldwork. So we usually end up with having some people who are very actively want to talk to us, and some of other people who don't have such passion to talk with us. So this seems to us like a sample selection problem, just as one of the person in the audience asked the question like, the government is going to intervene in the interview process, and then they probably can select the people who are more likely to be favorable to the government, and they are going to answer our questions in the interview. Or in the other case, those who are more likely to be the losers in the policy, they are more likely to answer our questions. So the bias could go either way. So if this is the case, how are we going to deal with such biases due to the sample selection? What are the strategies for the graduate students to deal with them? Could I send this question direct to Malanie, and then we can open this up to all the panelists, and we are going to end this panel.
So very briefly, it's actually, in a way, we want to take, especially as graduate students, I think you want to take advantage of this bias. You need people to talk to you. You are very interested in interviewing people who have, who are interested in talking to you. And Reed is right. A lot of them happen to be the losers in some battle. And you know, my dissertation was interviewing retired officials. You know, they got lots of time. They have nothing to lose. You know, they can speak their mind. So I think be mindful of bias. And then I went and interviewed the other side. And so that's what you do, is you interview the winners, right? But I think given the situation, as a graduate student, you might think about who it is would be, what group of people would be most willing to talk to you. And that's not a bad place to start. I think that's not a bad place to start at all. I wouldn't say you want to end there, but I think that is a great place to start, especially when you have few resources. As graduate students tend not to have this kinds of connections and resources and possibilities to offer. So I do think, I mean, Reed's absolutely right. There is the bias, but I think you also want to take advantage of exactly the reasons why people want to talk to you. are you wrapping up this panel?
We still have.
You have a minute.
Yeah. Isa, do you want to say something?
Not me.
Yeah, to briefly answer the question about sample representativeness. I think there are different types of data we're collecting with our fieldwork. And then for some data, you want to achieve representativeness, and for others, it's less of a concern. So I think there's kind of 3, 4, 5 different types of data that we're collecting. But I think, just to use 2 examples. So one is, if you're trying to get a sense of public opinion in China in general, on average, what does a Chinese person think? Then obviously, you need a sample that's representative of the entire population, but that's not always the kind of data we're gathering. So if you're trying to figure out, how did this policy unfold, who were the decision makers, and so on and so forth. So that's a different type of data. And I think for that, we might follow established procedures in journalism. And Maria can talk about that on how to triangulate and so on and so forth. So for those type of data, sample representativeness is not really the issue here anyway. So I think, and then we can, and I think I'll just stop here.
Great, thank you, Isa. And we really have run up our time. So again, thanks again to our panelists, Mary, Maria, Lizhi, and Saul for sharing these great suggestions and comments and advice. And Melanie, back to you.
Okay, this is great. Fantastic panelists and great job in moderating and ending right on time. So I have posted the website where the recording of this will be posted soon. And thanks to our attendees and those who registered and who will listen to the website. As I say, we will be organizing the new faces. That will be probably our next event for graduate students. And we will be sharing information about that very soon. Thanks a lot.